Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Cassandra. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Cassandra mentioned, I will be discussing artworks which were made in response to different viruses and epidemics, such as the Black Death, smallpox, cholera, the Spanish flu, AIDS, and of course, COVID-19. And hopefully, looking at these works will help us make sense of what's happening in the world right now. So today, I will be starting with images of the Black Death. This disease returned on numerous occasions throughout history, and it appeared under several different names, including the Black Death, the Great Plague, the Bubonic Plague, and the Great Mortality. So the first work I would like to show you is from 1347, titled "The Citizens of Tournai, Belgium, Burying the Dead During the Black Death." So the Black Death was seen by many who lived through it as a punishment from God, and this was reflected in European art and culture in particular. This miniature shows plague victims being buried en masse. There are 15 mourners and 9 coffins, and they're all crammed into this very small space together. Interestingly, each face of the mourners has been given individual attention. They each express genuine sorrow, but I think even more genuine fear. These outbreaks caused severe social and physical devastation, with countless people dying around the world. And that's something we're becoming very familiar with nowadays. Archaeologists have actually found evidence of these types of mass burials as a result of the Black Death. Here we have a photo of a large cemetery, which was discovered in 1986, located near the Tower of London in East Smithfield. It contained a mass burial pit filled with several hundred skeletons. It was opened in either late 1348 or early 1349 by the Bishop of London, and it was actually one of 2 emergency burial grounds that was created to cope with the Black Death epidemic. And unfortunately, this is an image that we've kind of become very familiar with recently, especially with those images on the news of the mass graves in Hart Island, New York, during the COVID outbreak last year. But returning to the Black Death, at the time of the 1347 outbreak, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote a collection of novellas known as the Decameron. This text referenced the decimating effects of the bubonic plague. In it, he describes the physical, social, and psychological sufferings. He wrote of people dying in the street of plague boils and swollen glands, some the size of eggs, others as large as apples, as we can see described in this quote here. Boccaccio, like many others, attributed the cause of the plague to divine punishment for poor behaviour and an unequal society. This idea of plague as punishment is reflected in the next work we'll be looking at, The Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel the Elder. In this work, the triumph of death is symbolised by this army of skeletons raising the earth. All of the social institutions are included in this composition, and they're all subject to the same fate, as death knows no boundaries of class or wealth. The background is this barren landscape with scenes of destruction taking place, kind of creating this sense of an apocalyptic event. The entire work is cast in this reddish-brown tone that creates this feeling of being trapped inside an inferno. The painting also depicts a customary theme from medieval literature known as the Dance of Death. In art of this genre, skeletons are often seen dancing or performing routine tasks, like we can see in these close-ups here. Bruegel's painting is a reflection on the fragility of life and the certainty of death due to an unremorseful natural order. The Dance of Death reflects the accepted reality of the time, which was that life was solitary, brutish, and short. Similarly here, we have French painter Nicolas Poussin's painting The Plague of Ashdod, in which he tries to make sense of the violence and misery caused by the Italian plague between the 1629 and 1631. He chose an episode from the Hebrew Bible in which the Philistines steal the Ark of Covenant from the temple in Jerusalem. Here, Poussin draws a pointed contrast between the stately serenity of the classical architecture and the human sin that, at least according to the Bible, caused the outbreak in the first place. He was actually one of few artists who focused on the stench that accompanies the plague, as his figures avert their heads and cover their noses. His work also details how human relationships can break apart as a result. In the foreground here, a nursing mother has died along with one of her children. The other child is still trying to feed from her breast, completely unaware of what's happened. And this young man here is holding his nose while he bends to lift the child to safety. The limp, greying bodies that lie beneath him are now just corpses and a mortal danger to everyone else. On the painting's far left, the Ark of Covenant stands on a pedestal. When the Philistines returned the Ark to the people of Israel, the plague lifted. I think that Poussin's trying to ask the same question here. The people, who's basically asking the people of Rome what they intend to do to stop God's wrath and bring an end to the Black Death outbreak. The Black Death was a horror that kept returning for more than 300 years, and it became a regular part of everyday life in Europe, with terrible outbreaks periodically devastating cities between the 14th and the 17th century. One image most commonly associated with the Black Death, and one that is still referenced in pop culture today, is the plague doctor mask. As you can see in this engraving, personal protective equipment existed long before COVID-19. This protective costume was used in France and Italy in the 17th century, and it terrified people because it was associated with imminent death. It consisted of an ankle-length overcoat, a bird-like beaked mask, along with gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. As we can see in this example here, the mask had glass openings in the eyes and a curved beak in front of the doctor's nose. The mask also had two small nose holes, and it was kind of like this early form of a respirator. And it held sweet or strong smelling substances like dried flowers or herbs and spices. And the purpose of this was to try and keep bad smells away from the doctor's nose. This was known as miasma, and they thought that this was how disease was spread at the time. But returning to the previous image, we can see a wooden cane pointer in the doctor's right hand. This was used to help examine the patient without having to touch them. It was also used as a means for repenting sins, as people still believed that plague was punishment, and so they would actually ask the doctor to whip them. But wooden cane aside, this medieval hazmat suit still has many of the same elements that we see in the personal protective equipment we use today. In July 2020, the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands opened their Contagious Exhibition, which explored the outbreaks of infectious disease throughout history. We can see in this image here, the dummy wearing the replica of the doctor's plague mask along with the big trench coat, and then nearby stands, a more modern mannequin wearing the blue medical gown, plastic goggles, face mask, and disposable gloves that have all become this universal symbol that we now associate with the fight against COVID-19. There are actually many similarities between the public health response to the Black Death and the public health measures we have in place today. Along with the plague doctor mask, home inspections of suspected cases took place, with doctors isolating the infected and their families. As we can see in this etching here, infected people were quarantined in their homes, and everyday items were disinfected to stop the spread of the virus. So this fear of the Black Death continued for centuries, inspiring artists even when outbreaks occurred on the other side of the world. It is believed that this painting by Arnold Böcklin was inspired by news about the Third Plague, which started in China in 1855 and eventually made its way to Bombay by 1896. This nightmarish vision of death riding a winged creature as it ravages the streets of a medieval town demonstrates that fear of the plague did not diminish over the years. In the foreground, we can see a weeping figure has thrown herself over the body of a deceased person, almost as if she's trying to protect it from the figure hovering above. The vibrant blood red color of her dress is juxtaposed against the blacks, browns, and greens, which symbolize death and decay. The contrasting colors and the vivid, nightmarish imagery evoke this intense emotion of fear and dread due to the devastating effects of the plague in China, Hong Kong, and India in the 1800s. This imagery even made its way outside of the realm of art and into other objects, like the medal pictured here. It was given by Hong Kong authorities to nurses, civil servants, police, British Army, and naval personnel who helped during the epidemic. It shows a Chinese man being tended to by a nurse while a man holds off the angel of death. And this sense of fear of death and fear of the unknown was not exclusive to the Great Plague. We have an illustration here from an illuminated manuscript titled "Clerics with Leprosy Receiving Instruction from a Bishop." The illustration accompanies text which outlines how to decide what should be done when clerics suffer a disabling condition such as leprosy. We can see in this image that the figures are covered in red spots. And because of these highly visible lesions, people were often pushed to the margins of society. Because people with leprosy didn't necessarily die straight away, their survival and their very existence was seen as a threat to the public. And so they were often shunned and forced to live as like a separate caste of people. In some instances, lepers were forced to wear marked clothing or to wear bells which jangled when they walked to announce the leper's presence, which we can see in this image here. This fear was exacerbated by religious interpretations at the time, which suggested that lepers were dirty and that their physical deformities were manifestations of spiritual transgression. Smallpox has been depicted in a very similar fashion, with red lumps covering the bodies of those afflicted. This source documents the Aztec experience with smallpox, which was brought over by European explorers. They have the telltale spots all over their bodies, and they're lying in a weakened state, wrapped in blankets, lying on mats. Spanish invaders introduced the smallpox virus to the indigenous population in the 16th century, and it ravaged the Aztec population as the indigenous people had no immunity to the virus. And the subsequent decimation of their population made both conquest and colonization by the Spanish that much easier. Here we have a more contemporary example of art looking back on events surrounding colonization and the spread of smallpox. This sculpture was actually part of our council curated exhibition Shaping Wit at Art Space on the Concourse earlier this year. The sculpture, it was made by Will Coles, and Black Douglas added the native colour titles. It relates to incidents where British occupying forces are strongly suspected of deliberately giving smallpox-infected blankets to Indigenous people. And for this reason, the work can only be shown in maybe 2 locations in the world. The first is Pittsburgh in America, and the second is right here in New South Wales, where this deliberate sabotage is suspected of taking place. The work, it looks like a harmless blanket just lying there innocently on the ground, but it's inscribed with the words variola major, the virus that causes smallpox. And this was a virus that impacted many countries around the world for centuries, including Japan. The Japanese smallpox epidemic in the 700s was the first of many outbreaks throughout Japan's history, and it devastated the country for hundreds of years. In this print, it depicts the mythical samurai warrior Minamoto no Tamatomo resisting the 2 smallpox gods, Variola Major and Variola Minor. The warrior was known for his endurance and his fortitude, and he's portrayed here as strong and confident in his bright red armor, very detailed. And in comparison, the smallpox gods are quite colorless compared to him. He takes up a large portion of the composition, and he's armed with a sword and a quiver full of arrows, whereas the smallpox gods look terrified of him and they're fleeing away. And they're actually, kind of confined to the corner of the print there. This interpretation of diseases and epidemics as being the work of powerful plague gods or demons was common throughout the world. The statue on the left here is of Shapona, who was the god of smallpox in the Yoruba people's religion in Western Africa. In the beginning, the supreme god decided to delegate authority of the earth to his eldest son, Shapona. And the Yoruba people believed that the god who causes grains to rise from the earth and nourish mankind also causes those grains to come out of the skin of the people who consume them. And it's because of that belief that smallpox was seen as a sign of Shapona's displeasure. Similarly, on the right, we have a statue of Shitala, the smallpox goddess from the Indian subcontinent. Shitala is represented as a young maiden riding a donkey, holding a short broom, either to spread the germs or to dust them off, depending on her mood. She's also carrying a pot in her other arm that was either full of the virus itself or it contained cold water, which was used as a healing tool. She used smallpox as a means to chastise humans when they refused to worship her. And it was only once they corrected their mistakes and acknowledged her properly that she would then heal the smallpox sufferers. And she even is thought to have resuscitated those who had died. Interestingly, smallpox was the first virus epidemic that was ended by vaccination. In this painting by Ernest Board, Dr. Edward Jenner is performing his first vaccination against smallpox on the young boy James Phipps. Today, smallpox has been certified as globally eradicated by the World Health Organization. And looking at all of the countless deaths that were caused by just this one disease, I think this image really stands out as a glimmer of hope to us right now. Of course, vaccination wasn't perfect, and it lacked the testing and safety protocols that we have today. Here we have a vaccination case from the 1920s. Calves were injected with smallpox, and the lymph material from the pus, which was caused by the disease, was then used as the vaccine. Previously, they used human lymph instead, but it was made illegal from 1898 onwards as it spread other diseases such as syphilis. And that brings us to our next work, Marriage à la Mode. So this is part of a series of 6 pictures by William Hogarth, and it's intended as a very pointed indictment of 18th century society. This particular series illustrates the disastrous consequences of marrying for money. So the basic story here is of a marriage arranged between 2 self-seeking fathers. One is a broke nobleman who spent all his money, and the other one is a wealthy merchant who's looking to buy his way into the aristocracy. In this particular scene, referred to as the inspection, the character known as Viscount Squanderfield is accompanied by a sickly-looking girl and a woman as they visit a doctor. And the implication here is that they're all there to be treated for the sexually transmitted disease, syphilis. So brandishing his cane in one hand and holding out a pillbox in the other, the Viscount seems to be protesting that the doctor's pills don't work. And the pills are of black mercury, matching the black mark on the Viscount's neck, which Hogarth typically used to denote syphilis. At the time of Hogarth's paintings, mercury was administered to patients suffering from syphilis. The sores caused excruciating pain, but in mid-18th century England, the common treatment of mercury could cause even more complications, and people often died of the cure rather than the disease. The Hogarth print depicts a shelf of apothecary ceramic jars, 1 or 2 of which probably contained mercury ointment, like this jar from the Royal Pharmaceutical Society's museum. This tin-glazed earthenware is dated from around 1700 to 1730, and it would have been available from apothecaries during Hogarth's time. So while many artists use their medium as a means of critiquing behaviour and providing warnings for the consequences of immoral behaviour, others, such as Francisco Goya, use their art as an expression of the things that we should be grateful for. In this portrait, Goya depicts himself as a shriveled, washed-out old man, yet the main actor in this image is his doctor, who is shown in colours more vivid and lines crisper than anyone else. By elevating the doctor to be the scene's chief character and simultaneously letting himself fade into obscurity with those figures in the background, he's basically making the point that Dr. Arrieta deserves the primary role in this painting due to his dedication to his work and the countless lives that he saved throughout his career. The same year that Goya completed this painting, the Spanish government sent Dr. Arrieta to Africa to study the plague outbreak. While he was there, unfortunately, Dr. Arrieta contracted the illness and died as a result. And so in this way, the portrait isn't just a tribute to one man, it's a tribute to the whole medical profession. And I think this is something that most of us can relate to today, the admiration and gratitude that we have for doctors and frontline workers who risk their lives on a daily basis to fight this pandemic. In contrast, the outbreak of cholera in the 1830s led to suspicion of medical practitioners. Here we have Robert Crookshank's Etchings, which spoke on the uncertainty the public had in doctors at the time. As cholera kept spreading and kept getting worse, and so people started to think that maybe the doctors were deliberately prescribing treatments that would prolong their illness and therefore enhance the doctor's profits. In Crookshank's print, the wealthy doctor can be seen helping himself to a very generous portion of pie, and it's etched with the words £20 per day. And this is reinforced by the cascade of coins falling from the slice on his fork and pooling around his feet. In the second etching, the artist turns his attention to the impoverished public and therefore extends his ridicule of the medical treatment or medical management of cholera. So the terrified and emaciated patient is perched next to a table that's literally propped up by human bones, and it's laden with all these different treatments. His elbow is poking through these threadbare clothes, and he's leaning on this box of mercury pills, another use of mercury that probably caused more harm than good. It's also sitting next to this emetic bottle. It's kind of got this weird anthropomorphic shape to it. These creepy claw-like hands extend from the top of the bottle, and coupled with that fee-fo-fum skeleton, under the table, all of these creepy, dark images seem to allude to the impending doom of the patient. Over time, though, as more plagues and epidemics took hold across the world, modern and contemporary artists have created self-portraits to make sense of their own plague suffering, while also contemplating the transcendent themes of life and death. So here we have Edward Munch's self-portrait after Spanish influenza, which he painted in 1919. Fortunately, Munch recovered from the Spanish flu, but we can see in this self-portrait just how ill he became. As we see here, Munch's hair is thin and his complexion appears jaundiced. While his body was still grappling with the flu, he seems to have painted his trauma. He looks exhausted, pale, and lonely. There is this strong sense of disorientation and disintegration, while with the figure and the furniture kind of blending together to reflect his delirious state. Unlike some of Munch's previous depictions of illness, like the images we have here, where he portrays the sick person's loved ones waiting with anxiety and fear, the artist has instead portrayed himself as the victim who has to endure his illness isolated and alone. While Munch is using his work to reflect on the reality of his illness, he's also attempting to exercise control here. It becomes a type of coping mechanism for both him and the viewer, by evoking a sense of empathy and compassion with the subject. So as in Munch's self-portrait, US artist David Boynarovich also used his art practice in an attempt to assert agency after he was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. In this deeply personal, untitled self-portrait, he reflects upon his own mortality. About 6 months before he died of AIDS, Boynarovich was driving through Death Valley in California with a friend when he pulled over to the side of the road and began to dig his own grave with his bare hands. Here, he takes control of his own fate by preempting it, wrestling back control of his illness by performing his own burial. One of his best known, and probably also one of his most haunting works, is Untitled Falling Buffaloes. It was also created in response to the AIDS crisis. And here, Boynarovich seems to be drawing a parallel between the AIDS crisis and the mass slaughter of American buffaloes in the 19th century. As the herd of buffaloes fall off a cliff to their deaths, the artist evokes this feeling of doom and hopelessness, making the work extremely powerful and provocative. It reminds viewers of the neglect and marginalization that characterized the politics of HIV/AIDS at the time. People who were diagnosed with AIDS, they faced a social stigma and isolation in the same way as other epidemics in history, such as leprosy. Driven by fear and ignorance, those who suffered from the virus were often isolated from wider society. Many people, including doctors, actually refused to touch patients who were diagnosed with HIV in fear of contracting the illness themselves. So this physical and social isolation that accompanies plagues and epidemics is something we're still experiencing today with COVID-19. Early on in the pandemic, performance artist Miranda Davies, she was forced into self-isolation when she contracted the flu. And she said that this lack of touch, or what she described as skin hunger, was impacting her emotionally and physically. So she came up with her performance work, Imprints. And it's what she described as a service for those suffering from social distance. So in the performance piece, a participant gets to have a moment being held by Davies while she's wearing the personal protective equipment. Davies said that she really wanted to think about the imprints on our bodies without touch, and also the imprints that are happening to the environment because of all the personal protective equipment that is being used now. In order for the performance to be carried out safely, proper PPE was necessary, but the accumulation of these single-use items will also have a significant impact on the environment. What was most interesting for Davies was the accumulation of both the detritus of waste of the single PPE, as well as the accumulation of emotions that were being imprinted on her body as she held each person. She said those emotions included fear, sadness, and the feeling of being overwhelmed. And that feeling of being overwhelmed and seeking comfort and safety is something I think we can all relate to, and is reflected in this work by Pamela Liu. Safety blanket refers to the idea of the security blanket and its capacity to provide comfort in times of worry. Each patch of the blanket has been embellished with the four-leaf clover, an international symbol of luck. And the work is a metaphor for what we as a community are all collectively going through, and as well as the need for a meditative healing process in order to find that comfort and that sense of hope. So the work was made with handmade paper, and we can see this process in her short film, Apart and New. Both the blanket and the film were made for our council curated exhibition Retracing at Art Space on the Concourse last year, and they were both made in response to the 2020 lockdown. In the film, we see the artist methodically tear up the paper in an almost contemplative and methodical type way. This is contrasted against the sound of rushing water and the pulped paper as it is sucked down the drain. These actions symbolize the idea of turmoil versus meditative healing. Similarly, First Nations artist Kent Morris has also used his practice to reach people and to find connection during the COVID lockdown. In August 2020, the people of Melbourne could find the words "Never Alone" emblazoned across a digital billboard at the intersection between Grey and Fitzroy Streets in St Kilda. For 20 seconds every 3 minutes, these words appeared across a dual geometric black pattern with the recurring image of a native Nankeen night heron. This was a bird that Morris frequently encountered on his night walks during lockdown. And according to Morris, COVID-19 has caused us to reframe how we collectively perceive time. We remember the past, we have an anxious present, and there's an uncertain future ahead of us. And his billboard is intended to show us that we're a part of something greater. So over the last 18 months or so, as galleries have either had to close or reopen in altered circumstances, Morris and other artists around the world have all continued to make art, whether it's in person, online, or even in the streets, that speaks to connection, dislocation, and what it means to be human right now. So the last work I want to discuss today is by Italian artist Milo Manara. In March 2020, he posted a series of images on his Facebook and Instagram accounts that showcased a nurse fighting coronavirus head-on. He posted 8 images called Courage, which showed how nurses have become heroes during the pandemic. So we can see in this series of images, the nurse has taken a moment alone. She's just leaning against the wall, looking totally drained. We can see the markings on her face from where the face mask has rubbed against her, and she just kind of gradually crumbles to the floor and just holds her head in her hands and just lets herself feel the emotional and physical exhaustion that she's probably experiencing. But then a moment later, she picks herself back up, she puts her face mask back on, and she runs off, literally coming face to face with COVID-19. Manara has since expanded the theme into other frontline and essential workers, all wearing face masks to protect them against the virus. In the face of such profound tragedy, Manara's pencil and watercolour paintings of grocery workers, carriers, truckers, sanitation workers, and medical professionals shines a beautiful and I think necessary light on the brave people who are working day and night to keep those statistics under control and to keep society functioning. His illustrations are touching and poignant, paying tribute to women helping battle COVID-19 on all fronts. So, viewing all of the artworks I have discussed today from the perspective of a contemporary pandemic, there are themes that many of us, I think, can relate to, including depictions of self-isolation, hospitalization, loss of loved ones, or loved ones suffering from an illness. Another unmistakable trend that comes through is how much worse marginalized communities were affected by these diseases. And unfortunately, that's something that still holds true today with COVID-19. But I hope that looking back at how people over thousands of years have experienced pandemics, makes processing our current situation a little bit easier and maybe even helps to connect to those histories. So thank you for joining us today. We have listed here some books that may be of interest to you. I'll also include this list in our follow-up email afterwards. So we'll now open this up for discussion. Please remember to send us any questions or comments in the Zoom chat.
Thank you, Miriam. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Well, until we get some questions in from our audience, I'm hoping that they do shoot us a few. I've actually got a few that I kind of collated from the different rehearsals that we did. People asked me some questions, so I thought I'd save them and ask you today whilst we wait. Hopefully our audience will send us a few though as well. The first one I've got is, did the makers of the plague mask did they deliberately make it look like a bird?
Well, I don't know if that was their intention when they designed it. Yeah, I couldn't find necessarily any evidence that suggested that was their intention, but the design of the mask was definitely intended to protect the doctor's nose. And so I think because they had to fill it with those substances like herbs and spices, they needed something to contain those items and protect the doctor's nose. So yeah, I don't know if it was necessarily, yeah, they wanted it to look like a bird. It was more just the most logical way for them to design it.
And thank you, Miriam. Another question that I've got here for you is, when did they work out that Mercury was making things worse? Terrible. You just, it's an awful history, isn't it, to think that, you know, medicine
was poisoning people.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Definitely. Well, yeah, once again, when I was doing my research, I couldn't find a definitive time frame. I kind of assumed that it was somewhere in the 19th century, but I did recently find something that suggested it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it actually fell out of favor. I mean, I kind of hope that's not true. But either way, I think it was definitely a gradual realization. I mean, I did read somewhere that certain doctors in the late 1700s and early 1800s kind of started to realize that these side effects were worse than any perceived benefits. So they started looking for alternatives. But yeah, I think it was definitely a gradual thing.
It looks like I've got a question coming in from the audience, which is great. We've got lots of really kind words, Miriam.
Thank you.
But we've got a question that's come in, and it is, why did the man holding the Mercury have the black circle on his neck?
Oh, right. So Hogarth, syphilis appeared in a number of Hogarth's works, and he usually used the black dot to symbolize that. I mean, people sometimes got lesions on their skin, and so I think that's why he chose a black circle to denote that. And there was also like a visual connection between the pills and the physical signs of syphilis. So I hope that answers it.
And I've got another question here, which is basically, apart from the plague doctor's PPE, was there a practice amongst the general public of wearing protective masks?
Well, not necessarily masks, but I do know that some people would carry around hankies that had been soaked with different smells. Some people also had their handkerchiefs. They contained, dried flowers and herbs and spices and stuff, and that they would walk around the streets holding the handkerchief with those substances to their nose to try and protect themselves. Yeah, so that was kind of like the early form of a mask, I guess. Yeah, I don't know of anyone else wearing them other than the doctors.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds right to me from what I would have thought as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the worst part. That I was always told that that's where the nursery rhyme "Ring a Ring a Rosie" comes from. You know, pocket full of posy, a tissue. But I've then heard somewhere recently that's not actually what it's about. So, but either way,
what is it about?
I don't know. They didn't specify, so they were just like, "Oh, yeah, it's not actually about the plague," but they didn't provide any other information. So I don't know.
Okay, because I thought it did have to do with maybe not plague, but that idea of the way smells were used, you know, against this thing called miasma, and it was meant to be, you know, something that gave us disease. And anyway, look, I've got some really great comments. I mean, we've got some wonderful kind words, but we've got some nice I guess things that people are wanting to say. You know, of course, the AIDS epidemic spawned the ultimate fear-mongering commercial featuring the Grim Reaper. It was deemed as too confronting. Miriam, you know, you probably don't remember that ad. I certainly do.
I wasn't. You I was born in 1994. So.
Well, you know, didn't want to pry on your age there, but I knew that. I remember my kids were quite young. I remember that ad really well because I actually used to work in the advertising industry at the time, and it was really, it was a big deal when that ad came out. But I would have thought it was before you were born. Another, you know, a thing that someone else has commented on, you'd think in the 20th century some human may recognise that humour is a thing put in thermometers, not in human bodies. And yeah, I don't think there's any other questions there. So I'll go back to my list. Just keep an eye on the time. Yeah. Can you just sort of tell us more a little bit about who came up with the idea of using smallpox as a way of impacting Indigenous Americans? That was, that we had that artwork, as you know, in the Shaping Wit exhibition, and I'd actually curated that work before the collaboration with Black Douglas in the Hidden exhibition, where it was just Will Coles, and then obviously Will and Black are good mates, and Black actually added in the native colour titles. So yeah, did you want to just tell us a little bit more about who came up with that great, not so great idea?
Yeah,
terrible idea.
Yes. Yeah, well, in the case of Australia, we don't necessarily have the hard evidence to prove it, but there is a journal that belongs to one of the Marine captains that does indicate that the First Fleet did bring with it bottles of smallpox. And so you do have to wonder why they would bother doing that, considering most Europeans were actually immune to smallpox at that point in time. So what's the point in bringing it if you're not going to use it?
And particularly when it's something you probably don't want,
Yeah,
around.
Exactly. I don't really know where it would come in handy, except if you're trying to kill people. But anyway, like I said, we don't really have that hard evidence. But in the case in North America, we do actually have some more damning evidence. There are actually letters between British officers, including like high-ranking British officials, that basically indicate that they need to do whatever it takes to get rid of the Native Americans. There's actually an inventory list that specifically mentions 2 gifts of blankets, or a handkerchief and a blanket, that were intended to convey smallpox to the Indians. And I think, that's definitely an indication of an attempt at biological warfare. So it was definitely a planned attack from the British point of view.
Yeah, a terrible history, and also, of course, probably used the term Indians, which of course is not something that we would use today with regard to First Nations cultures wanting to define how they are actually culturally referred to. Another question. This one is, sorry, I'm just trying to read my notes. This question is, be interested to know if there were government mandated quarantine, if there were, at the time of the Hong Kong outbreak, were there government mandated quarantine rules at the time? Are they similar? Were they similar to today?
Well, once again, I couldn't find like a specific government mandate as such, but they definitely use some of the similar practices that we have in place today. There was isolation of the sick. There was disinfection. They disinfected households. There was even mention of plague hospitals and segregation camps. This occurred in both Hong Kong and India, and was carried out by the British forces. In sometimes a rather brutal way. Some people were evicted from their homes and had their houses burned down and their belongings destroyed. So it was all really, once again, another dark period of history that does not reflect well on white explorers. But so like I said, there was no, as far as I could tell, there wasn't like an official government mandate, but there were definitely similar practices that they carried out.
Yeah, so all under the name of empire. We, and obviously, we're still dealing with the fallout of these kind of things even today. So yeah, I think that might have exhausted my actual questions, but I actually have a few more comments that have come in, which is great. look, one of them is actually a comment which I've got to read out because I think it's quite an interesting thing to know. I do know this person who sent it. And one of our audience actually remembers being an extra in a Grim Reaper ad as an impoverished student in the 1980s. Wow. Yeah, the fear mongering was certainly prevalent. So yeah, very interesting. We've also got another question, which is, how was the goddess of smallpox discovered as a hoax? Did people slowly figure it out over time? Also, did she want to kill them, or just try to cure them of smallpox?
So I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by hoax. It was more just this belief within the community that she was the one who was causing it and could reverse it if she wanted to. So, so just remind me the second part of the question. What was it?
So the second part of the question is, did people slowly figure it out over time? I guess it sounds like more cultural belief, perhaps changing. Maybe there are people who still believe that. I wouldn't know. And also, did she want to kill them or just try to cure them of smallpox? From memory, it seemed to be a bit of both, didn't it?
Yeah, she was definitely, so she was basically in charge of smallpox. So when people displeased her, she would infect them with smallpox. But if they corrected their mistakes, she would then cure them and yeah, reverse it basically. So.
Okay. The person's actually replied and said, sorry, that was a loaded question, but thank you for answering.
Well, I hope I, sort of answered it.
Okay, well, I think that we haven't got any more questions coming in, and I've certainly exhausted my list. Someone has mentioned here Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, number 16. Sorry, A Journal of Plague Year -16. We'll certainly follow up on that. But I think, yeah, we're probably at a point where we could wrap up because I can't see any other questions coming in. And that person was basically saying it's an interesting, though not easy read for A Journal of the Plague Year. So thank you for that. And we will definitely, yeah, follow up on that. Where we go from here, look, thank you so much, Miriam, for leading on putting that together. I know it was, yeah, you did some really great research there, and I've certainly really enjoyed working with you as we put, you've mostly put it together. And I'd also really like to, I've got a few little things to announce at the end. We've just got another one that's come in, look at Lapham's quarterly volume number 13, Epidemic, because all these sort of suggestions, we can certainly add them in to the reading list. But where we go from here is, obviously we've got another talk coming up next Friday called Laugh a Question. It's going to be a little bit in reverse of what we've presented today. I think I'll be doing that one. I'm a bit nervous, got some big shoes to fill after yours. Unfortunately, I've got so much going on that I can't guarantee it's going to be good as yours. But we'll certainly endeavour to present present well next Friday. So we'd love it if any of you could join again for the 24th of September, same time, same place, Zoom, 24th of September. And then we've also, something that we've got coming up is another talk with an artist talk. This is more with some of our local North Shore artists who are actually involved with the online craft, Sydney Craft Week Festival that's now unfortunately had to go online because of COVID. And that talk will be Miriam and myself in conversation with Robin Kennedy and Sion Cho, who have exhibitions scheduled at Incinerator Art Space and Art Space on the Concourse. At this point, we've still left them in our programming. Obviously, if we're not open, they won't be able to go ahead. But at the moment, we just know, our lockdown is till the 27th of September. So we've kept programming in place until then. We will be sending you a follow-up email. In that email will be a link to Pamela Liu's video, Apart Anew, so that you can actually see, have a look at what that video actually looks like in motion. We'll be sending you a link to the recording of today. We'll be sending you the library list that we've actually put together, and it looks like we might be having to add a few more things because we've had some great suggestions in this morning. We'll also give you the opportunity to subscribe to our e-news. You may have already joined us because you're already on our e-news, but if you're not, it's a really good opportunity to find out what else we do, other events that are coming up. It'll also let you know when we're able to open the art spaces again. And it will also give you the details of the 2 talks that I've just mentioned, the one next week and the one on the 15th of October with Robin Kennedy and Seong Cho. Obviously, from that email, please do email us back if you've got any questions that you thought, oh, you know, actually, because when we did our rehearsals, we had our people that were our pretend audience. They actually came back and asked us some questions after the talk. You might do the same and want to ask us some things, so please don't hesitate to get in touch. And as I said, if you've got any feedback about today, this was our first time. I think we were both a little bit nervous about, you know, something going wrong technically. So if you have anything that you want to sort of share with us so that we can do better, yeah, please don't hesitate. And obviously, yeah, you know, we obviously want to stay in contact with you all if you're keen to come back to the art spaces when they reopen. So once again, thank you, everyone. I've just had a whole lot more comments come in. I'll just make sure that everything's just, you know, no questions there, but I guess we'll sign off now. Once again, Miriam, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank all the people that joined us today. We really appreciate that pretty much mostly everyone hung in there till the end. So that's, I suppose that's good. Good news that you're still with us. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on Zoom again, and maybe even in the art spaces when we're able to open.